you are carrying a story that is always looking for a place to be said and a place to be spoken. Mm-hmm. And that is because we are so quick to jump in, right? Like there's just no, when we start allowing people to tell the truth about their own experience without fixing it, correcting it, hijacking it, telling them it's not that bad, well, then maybe we start building the world that we want, where all of our losses are heard and respected and given the airtime and the support that they deserve. And then we don't have to look for any possible opportunity to tell the story.
Does she care that I doubt? Does she care that I fear? Something tells me God will survive. So take a breath.
Welcome to the Deconstructionist Podcast. I'm your host, John Williamson, and we are back. It's 2023. I know you guys have waited patiently for a while for new content, but as I mentioned in kind of the teaser episode, wanted to be able to provide more content more frequently and in a way that didn't absolutely overload me. So hopefully you guys like this new format and the shorter episodes that are cut into two parts. So I'm not cheating anybody of any content. Believe me, I promise. Just cutting into two parts, a little more digestible. So hopefully you guys like that. You know, if you love it, if you hate it, let me know. You can contact me through the website, www.thedeconstructionist.com. There you can find all of our stuff. So social media, you can find our web store. So if you want a pint glass or a t-shirt or a coffee mug, if you want to support us on Patreon, you can do so there. We have a blog, some stuff for you to read on there, and you can also stream our entire back catalog of episodes, over 150 something now, I think. I should probably know this. I'm the one who edits these podcasts. So, but anyway, welcome back, and so want to take some time here to talk a little bit about what is upcoming. So, kind of formatting it in this weekly release and in two parts is going to allow me to do some really cool series this year and this season in particular. And so for the next 20 weeks or so, I believe, you will get a brand new episode every week. So to start it off, somewhat selfishly, if you've been following the podcast for a while, you know that I dealt with some parents with some pretty serious health issues at the end of last year. And unfortunately, we lost my mom in August to cancer. And so somewhat selfishly wanted to talk about grief and grieving, because to be quite honest, anybody who's listening out there who has been through the loss of a loved one or has supported someone who has lost a loved one knows that we as a society don't do a great job of supporting one another and knowing, how to support one another, how to grieve properly, how to give yourself that space and that time and that permission to grieve. And so I wanted to get some people on who are better at this, are more professionally equipped to talk about this topic than I am. And so who better than to get the author of my personal favorite book on the subject? It's Megan Devine. Megan Devine, if you don't know her, wrote the book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay, Meeting Grief and Loss in a Culture That Doesn't Understand. She is a psychotherapist who went through her own traumatic experience where she lost her partner in an accident, and he passed away right in front of her. And that obviously is absolutely horrible and traumatic. And she was looking for resources, even as a therapist, and there just wasn't a lot of good content out there, a lot of helpful resources out there. And so she wrote this book, and by far and away my favorite book on the topic, because it doesn't really pull any punches, but not in the sense that it's insensitive, but in the sense that it says, it kind of speaks to the reality of the situation. Like, yes, this sucks, and there's not a whole lot we can do about it. And there's nothing really anyone can say or do that's going to bring that person back. And the realities of it, but how do we put one foot in front of the other? How do we get to tomorrow? How do we get through the next day with this giant void in our life that now exists. And so it's a wonderful book. Got all of her links in the show notes, including her website, refugeingrief.com. She's also got her own podcast, but again, psychotherapist, author, speaker, podcaster extraordinaire, amazing guest. Had a wonderful time with her. Highly recommend her book if you don't have it. Even if you've never personally been touched by grief, it's just a really great resource in knowing how to better help our loved ones out there who may be going through it. So check it out. Other than that, buckle up because you're about to get a whole lot of content starting right now. So without further ado, I give you Megan freaking Devine.
His face must look like yours.
All right. Welcome to the podcast. I'm very, very excited this week to welcome Megan Devine to the podcast to talk about her amazing book, It's Okay That You're Not Okay. Welcome.
Thanks. I'm glad to be here.
Absolutely. So I was just telling you before we started recording, your book, it just kept popping up in my life in different ways. And I always take that as a sign that I need to look into this. And so my dad, who also does counseling on the side, highly recommends this book to anyone who needs it, and it kept popping up in his own grief class where other people would mention, yeah, I read this book. And then when asked, what book did you read? It's your book. And so this has really become the popular go-to book. And we'll talk a lot about why that is, but you really approach grief head on in a way and address the issue with largely the way that society kind of tries to help, I guess, those who are going through the grieving process and kind of falls short, we'll say.
Falls short, I think, is being polite about it. Very Midwestern about it.
Terrible. They suck at it.
Thank you. Yes, let's just call it what it is. Yeah, I think when I wrote It's Okay That You're Not Okay, there was nothing out there in the book world that really told the truth about what it's like to be a grieving person in this day and age at this time, which isn't to say that there wasn't good writing out there. It wasn't easily findable. There wasn't a place that really addressed it. There was a lot of rose-colored glasses work out there, and there still is around everything will be okay, just get through the memorial and then lean on your memories. And that is not practical. It's not actionable and it's not real. And I wrote the resource that I wanted for myself to be able to tell the truth about grief.
Yeah, and beautifully done. There's so many quotable moments in this book that I find myself just highlighting and highlighting and highlighting. After a while, I'm like, I'm going to run out of highlighter A and B.
Exactly. The entire book is highlighted.
Yeah. So I had to calm down a little bit by about the third chapter. But one of the things you said at the beginning of the book that I love is there's this quote where you say, what we all share in common, the real reason for this book is the desire to love better. And I think that's so right. I think although the people around us suck, at supporting us in grief, I think there is a well-meaning intention behind it. I just think that we're poorly equipped, and we've just kind of been raised in this culture that's kind of the way you do it. You throw some empty platitudes at them and you try to identify with them, and none of those things are helpful at all. And we all know this, and yet we still do it.
Yeah. And here's the thing. The complaints that I get about my work and the book are dwarfed by the good things, but the complaints that I get are, you got to cut your supporters some slack. They're doing the best they can. They have the best of intentions, and you need to hear the intention underneath their actions and their words. And I call bullshit on that, right? It is a normal human impulse to want to support and take care of the people we care about. That is a beautiful impulse. But as you just said, the ways that we have been taught to act on that impulse are wrong. And they are not delivering the love and care and support that we most want to give. The only way we get better at actually delivering our loving and our loving, caring intention, the only way we get better at that is hearing that what we're doing isn't working. right? If you really want to be supportive to your partner, your mom, your friend, the wider world, then we have to be willing to feel a little bit of discomfort when somebody says, hey, that doesn't help, right? This is true not only in grief, but in any kind of systemic change, right? Like, you and I are two white folks sitting down and having a conversation. We need to be willing to be uncomfortable when we hear people of color say, this actually is very uncomfortable. This feels whatever, right? Like, we don't need to take a whole detour into that. But what we're talking about here, what you and I are talking about, doesn't just belong to grief. This is about human connection, human relatedness and relationship. And how do we make what is in our hearts actually be received by the people around us in the way that we most long for? It really is about how do we listen and how do we love each other better, and acknowledging that the ideas that we've inherited, decades and decades and millennia, the ideas that we've inherited about how we deal with pain don't work. And we have to be willing to experiment with other things and find new ways to show up and care, because I do believe that most people really do have good intentions and beautiful intentions. I feel like my work is mostly, let me help you learn the skills that you need so that you can deliver the love you intend.
Yeah, and I think the book is equally as important to those who haven't necessarily gone through grief personally, so that they can be better equipped, as you said, to be there in a positive way for those who are going through grief. And you even mentioned in the book, you said, you may be on the outside looking in at some point, but at some point it could happen to you. It's going to happen to you. Everyone dies eventually. And so I think the book is equally as important for those who haven't yet been touched by death yet.
Yeah, I think it's a really helpful book to read if you're a human being who cares about other human beings. And again, yes, the book focuses largely on death, right? From the griever's perspective and from the helper's perspective. The tools that you learn in the book are tools for life, right? They're tools for somebody having a really crappy day. They're tools for somebody getting sick and needing to know that you're there for them. There is so much difficult stuff in human life, and learning how to talk about that in ways that help the person experiencing it feel heard and supported, and help the supporters feel like they're doing amazing work, being amazing friends. So yeah, I think it's a book for everybody, even though it talks very specifically about out of order deaths and traumatic experiences and all of these things. It's just the mechanics underneath the whole book, though, are really for everybody wanting to feel heard and supported no matter what is happening in their lives.
Morning people wake up for peace and quiet. McDonald's breakfast people, we wake up for the sweet rush of getting that warm, delicious breakfast right before it ends.
Crush your morning goals with a steak, egg, and cheese bagel or any breakfast sandwich, and snag another one for just $1 with the buy one, get one deal. Only in the McDonald's app. Limited time only at participating McDonald's. Valid once per day. Must opt into rewards.
Ba-da-ba-ba-ba.
Yeah. Oh, gosh. Talk a little bit about, you talk about the reality of grief and the power of acknowledgement, in the sense that I don't need you to fix it because you can't. So just tell me that you see it and you're here for me, and why empty platitudes just are worthless. I just want you, I think most people just want the acknowledgement, right? See me where I'm at and just give me a hug and sit next to me and let me feel it.
I feel like we don't think that's enough, so we skip over it, right? When somebody says they're experiencing something difficult, we jump right in with, at least you have your memories, or at least the sun is shining, or aren't you glad you got to do this before they died? We gloss over the statement of pain. And so grieving people, and remember that when I say grieving people here, it's not just grief related to death, although that's obviously in there. But if you identify as going through something difficult, we are talking about you. The thing that we need at that moment is for somebody to say, yeah, I see that. Yeah, that sounds really difficult. If you feel like you need to do more than that as a supporter, then ask. Like, not, is there anything I can do? Because that puts the burden on the person who's already having a hard time, but to say like, do you want to just be able to talk about that? Or do you feel like you want to problem solve around it? Like, do you want empathy or do you want a solution? Right? There is so much power in the simple act of acknowledging what somebody just said. I'm in the middle of as we're recording now, I'm in the middle of a 6-month training intensive with clinicians. And one of the ongoing homework assignments that we do in that training is, I call it pain spotting, right? Where you are listening out in the world, just like politely eavesdropping for statements of pain, right? The barista, when, the person in line in front of you asks the barista how they're doing, they're like, not that great. Like, the dog was up all night because they were sick. And then I was late getting in, and that sort of set off the whole morning. And then I dropped a pot of hot milk on my foot. And what do we normally say in response? Well, at least it's not raining anymore. Right?
Yeah.
So the exercise there is like starting to listen to it and starting to recognize that you can play with your responses to that. Right? Like, a great response to the barista having a bad day is like, that sounds really difficult for this early on a Monday morning.
Yeah.
And just see what happens, right? We think that acknowledging the truth of somebody's experiment is too small to be helpful, but honestly, it is incredibly powerful. And I really encourage people to start experimenting with that. Like, what happens when you allow what is true for somebody to be true for somebody without trying to change it or fix it for them? Run the experiment. Be a good scientist. Like, be curious about the world. What happens when you acknowledge the truth of a situation without trying to change it for somebody? It's pretty cool.
Yeah. What's interesting about that too, though, is I've noticed it myself too. Like this instinct to kind of try to identify with them through experiences of my own, which, over time realized not helpful.
No.
Everybody's experience is very, very different. And so in instances where I've tried to just stop and say, you know what, I'm really sorry. That's awful. It's interesting because the reaction is strange too, in the sense that the person that I say that to doesn't even know what to do with that,
Yeah.
They're just kind of like, it's okay, and like they don't, we're so conditioned on both ends.
We are totally conditioned on both ends. I mean, the entire experience of being human is awkward from start to finish. So like,
yes.
don't try to remove the awkwardness from your life, because it's not going to happen.
Right.
I think a couple of things are happening in that scenario that you just described. One, we are so accustomed to people hijacking, talking about themselves, or cheering us up, or changing the subject, or telling us it's not that bad, that when somebody doesn't do that, we're like, wait a second. What'd you just do there? Right? It jars us out of the expected cadence, right? So that's one thing. The other thing is, I think you're right. Like, we do have these expected things, and if we don't expect to be acknowledged in the truth of what we just shared, if we expect to have to defend ourselves, it's like we just changed the play. So I don't know what's going in there. The other thing, one of the things you mentioned in there was like, the person in your example starts saying, no, it's okay. Like, don't worry about it. Don't worry about me. That is also like a conditioned response.
Yes.
Right? Like, oh, you were just actually human to me. Sorry, didn't mean to make you do that. So sorry. Right? Like, that's a very Canadian Midwestern polite response thing to do. Oh, sorry, I didn't mean to make you feel something. My bad. Right?
Yeah, or burden you, with my problems.
I didn't mean to burden you. Right? Like, so, I mean, the thing is, like, I go back to awkwardness, right? As the root of all things. It's okay to have those awkward moments. It's okay as somebody who's going through a challenging time, whether it's, a challenging morning or a challenging decade, like whatever. I don't expect us to suddenly know what to do with appropriate support. That's a work in progress too. That's also learning. I do want to jump onto what you said about, like, I used to try to empathize by sharing my story. So this is something that we have been taught over and over again. And I think people are really surprised to learn that it doesn't get received as helpful. So I'm going to use my coffee shop again. Like if we're hanging out at the coffee shop, we're staying in line together, and I know somebody casually, because we see each other there every morning, and they ask me how I'm doing, and I say, not that great. My cat is 22 years old, and he was up all night because he's dying. And they're like, oh, that happened to me. I remember when my cat died. It was like this. So what they think they're doing is connecting with me. They think they're empathizing. They think they're letting me know that I'm not alone. But from my side of things, as the receiver, as the one currently going through this and answering your question as to how I'm doing, we're talking about you now. We're no longer talking about me. Now we're talking about you. Right? So it sort of has the opposite effect. It doesn't help me feel connected to you. It makes me very often feel like what I am currently dealing with is no longer, like, you don't actually want to support me in this. You don't want to hear about what this is like for me. You're not actually here for me. You're here for you. And one of the reasons, and I get into this in the book, but one of the reasons we do that, I call that grief hijacking, right? Like hijacking somebody's story with your own story, even with good intentions. We think we're doing that to connect, but it does have the opposite effect. And one of the complaints that I get when I talk about that, like, don't hijack somebody else's story. Some people are always like, no, I love hearing that other people have gone through this. Consent in all things is the thing to remember here. Consent in all things is the thing to remember. We'll go back to my hypothetical example of standing in line at the coffee shop and somebody asks me how I'm doing, and I say the cat is dying. A great, highly skilled response, awesome response would be, I'm so sorry that's happening. That's a lot to go through. I have walked through this before, and I know some resources locally. If there's any help you might like, I'm happy to share that with you. And then, what I just did there was, I didn't jump in with my advice. I didn't jump in with my story. I told them I have gone through this experience before. It wasn't the same as yours. I don't pretend to know what you're going through. There are some logistical things that I'm happy to help you with or answer questions for you if you might find that useful. Right? Consent in all things. Sometimes it's wonderful to have somebody who has gone through a similar experience that you're going through. Sometimes that is wonderful. For the last 9 years, I've been running a course called Writing Your Grief 10 times a year for the last 9 years. That's a lot of people. And what's amazing about watching that many people interact with each other, learn from each other, connect with each other, that there is something beautiful and useful in connecting with people who have experienced the same level of devastating loss as you have. The same level, but not the same loss. And one of the things that's really magical about communities like that is that everybody recognizes that they are sharing something together as a community, but their own individual experience is unique, and everybody respects that. So nobody tries to conflate things and be like, I lost a child and you lost a child, so it's exactly like this. It's more like, I see that you have visited a similar level of hell that I find myself in. And we live in very different rooms, and things look very different on the inside of these rooms, but I can see that you have been brought here as well, right? There are ways to connect with people and see each other that are kind and well-boundaried and skilled. And you only get those things if you interrupt your impulse to make things better or share your own story without getting permission first, all of that stuff. And I think the biggest thing for me in so much, something that sort of underlies a lot of it's okay that you're not okay, is slow down. As a person experiencing something really difficult, slow down. Slow down and ask yourself what you need. If there are tangible, actionable things that you can use from your support people, let's find a way to ask for those things. Especially slow down as a supporter, because we've been so deeply trained to make things better in so many ways that don't work. And again, you can slow down that impulse to care for people and then really put some thought into what is the most helpful action? What is actually called for in this situation? And can I do that? Right?
I love that approach because it starts out with an acknowledgement, but then it ends with options.
Yes.
Meaning that the person who's going through the grief can either just say thank you, thank you, and then that's it, or they can say, oh, then give you permission to tell your story and say, oh, tell me about how you went through this. So you're not just forcing your story onto them.
Yeah, you're not just forcing your story onto them. So you avoid the whole grief hijacking thing. You avoid the, oh, now we're talking about you. Oh, I remember what I was going to say. I lost my train of thought earlier when we were talking about this. Like, I think one of the big reasons we are so quick to jump in with our own story is because there are so few times in daily life where we get to tell the truth about what we experienced, right? So like if you're talking about, I'm going to keep going with this one because it's what's happening in my household today, but like end of life for a very elderly pet, right? That is an undervalued, underrespected loss in this culture, right? So not in my circle, because in my circle, I could talk about it all day long. But like for a lot of people, they're carrying a grief experience that because no one was available to listen, or people were like, no big deal, it's just an animal, or like, buck up and think about the good times. They had a really long life, whatever. Like if they feel like they could never say that, then there is a story always waiting in the wings. There is a story always waiting for an opportunity to get some airtime. So it's like if somebody asked me in line at the coffee shop, really beating this metaphor here, but like if somebody asked me in line at the coffee shop how my day's going and I say, not that great, the cat's dying, it's like a door gets unlocked for them. Like, oh, we're talking about grief now, I get to tell this story. We think we're being supportive and empathetic and all of those things. And I'm not saying that we're not, but there's also like, you are carrying a story that is always looking for a place to be said and a place to be spoken. And that is because we are so quick to jump in, right? Like there's just when we start allowing people to tell the truth about their own experience without fixing it, correcting it, hijacking it, telling them it's not that bad, well, then maybe we start building the world that we want, where all of our losses are heard and respected and given the airtime and the support that they deserve. And then we don't have to look for any possible opportunity to tell the story.
Yeah, I do feel in my experience off air, I think I told you, I unfortunately went through the loss of a parent the end of this last year, late into 2022, found out my mom had ovarian cancer, and it was very, very quick. Went into surgery the next month and came home for about a week. I was lucky enough to go up and cook for her for that week, and brought my daughter with me, and we got to spend time with her, not knowing that would be the last time I'd talk to her. And then we quickly, due to complications of the cancer and the surgery, lost her right after that. And it was bizarre just in and of itself because it felt surreal. But in terms of like interacting with people around me, I found that the younger people were the ones who kind of did a better job in just saying, the best thing I heard was like, hey, I'm so sorry. Like, just let me know if there's anything you need. And in that moment, I had no idea what I needed.
Sure.
I could barely understand what was happening, much less know what I needed, It was the older folks who were throwing the empty platitudes at me like, oh, well, now she's with God, and at least you had her for 43 years. And I'm like, yeah, but I wanted her for longer. My daughter got robbed of time with her grandmother, like that sucks and that's unfair and it pisses me off, but it was the older folks who we looked to as the kind of older, wiser generation that were really like not helpful. And it was the younger folks who maybe they read your book, I don't know, but they seemed a little more equipped to handle it in a good way that left me feeling like, okay, that was a good interaction in this moment where I'm just reeling,
Yeah. So first, thank you for sharing that with me. And you're right. You got robbed, and your mom got robbed, and your kid got robbed, right? Mm-hmm. It's bullshit. Yeah. And that's a really interesting observation about older generations. And I think we can look, if you're ready to move on to that. You ready? Okay.
Yeah.
All right. Consent in all things, right? Consent in all things. We want to make sure that the person is with us before we move on to a different subject. So, really interesting about older generations. So if you look generationally at what let's say folks, baby boomers, right? The boomers. And I'm going to take this moment to remind everybody that baby boomers were born after the Second World War. So like 45 to 50, because I think as a Gen X person, I'm like, I am not a boomer. I am not.
Same.
Anyway,
I'm not a millennial either.
I feel like I gotta represent for the Gen Xers, man.
Yep.
Anywho, that boomer generation comes from a time of keep calm and carry on. Don't air your dirty laundry. Don't talk about what is going on for you. This is also a very, very deeply ingrained time of children should be seen and not heard. I saw this morning when I was doing stuff that I really didn't need to be doing, but there was, an admin spiral going on in my life. I was looking at some YouTube comments for some of the videos on my YouTube channel, and somebody had a comment of like, get better, not bitter. Nobody wants to see you sad. Suck up and get over it. And I was like, let me guess. Are you over 60? Like, obviously I didn't respond because that's not worth the time. But like that mentality, that approach of suck it up, move on, don't show anybody any of this. You do not talk about this. Just muscle through. That is a product of a very specific generational time, right? You look at each generation changes and improves the situation of the previous generation. I'm not talking financially because we know that's not going well these days, but I'm talking about like, the women's movement of the 60s and the 70s, right, was in reaction to, but also built on the work of women in the workplace in the 40s and 50s, right? Like we build on what earlier generations have created for us. And I promise I'm bringing this one back, but like the millennials and our younger generations, I do think that they are better, not good. I think that they are better at emotional, relational things because the generations before them started breaking down those barriers. Like my generation, I grew up at a time when we were just starting to talk openly about child sexual abuse and violence against women. That stuff was all behind closed doors before. And it was one of those things that you don't share, you don't talk about. There were no news stories about it. There was nothing going on. And I'm not saying by any stretch that Gen X solved the problem of violence against women, because clearly we did not. But what we have now, and what the younger generations, the generations after Gen X came into, was an environment where we talk about this stuff. They came into an environment where, this seems really stupid now, but like, they came into an environment where we know that abuse and violence is wrong. And that was not the environment that my mom grew up in. Right? Yeah. So all of this coming back to, I agree with you. I think that a lot of our older generations, a lot of their belief systems are rooted in that emotions are the enemy. And in order to survive, you must shut down all emotion. Right? I mean, this is a really interesting exploration that we won't go into today about like how parents try to protect their children from harm by damaging them first. So, I mean, there's a whole thing. But this whole idea of like the way that I survive this family system and this culture is to not show any emotion. Right?
So unhealthy.
It's so unhealthy. And back then it was survival, right? If you are a little kid in the 50s and you are feeling and you are experiencing and expressing emotions in that culture, you're going to get your ass kicked, right? There are abusive lived realities for being a feeling human being. And what you learn is button up, keep it quiet, don't say anything, don't rock the boat, right? And you grow up with that, and then that is what you believe is proper. And so you get these young upstarts now who are like feeling things and talking about it and saying, no, this is wrong and this is right. And we protect this and we advocate for this. And they're like, wait a second. Now you're making my entire understanding of the safety of the world, calling that into question. So all of that really cool cultural, sociological, anthropological explorations are freaking fascinating. I love them. And what that means on the ground for people going through a hard time is just what you experienced. You've got a lot of people especially in older generations, who want to talk you out of your pain very quickly because that is what they have learned. You've got a lot of people who want to be helpful and supportive, and they are a bit more emotionally literate or emotionally experienced because of the cultural soup that they're growing up in and what they know is possible and expected. You do still have a lot of people who, no matter what age range they're in, no matter what generation they're in, we still have so much cultural messaging that says the best thing you can do for somebody going through a hard time is to help them stop feeling so bad. The clothing we put on that gesture differs from generation to generation, but the messaging is the same, right? So you might find somebody in their 70s basically giving you like, at least they're with God now, buck up, little camper, your mom wouldn't want you to be sad, like they lived along, like the platitudes that have been around for a while. You might have a younger person saying, yeah, life is really hard for so many people, and we really should just be seeding love everywhere we go. Now that sounds prettier, but it's the same message. So the clothing that we put on, our impulse to make things better, does change generationally. But the impulse to take somebody's pain away from them instead of help them withstand it, that is a bedrock that needs updating.
Could not agree more. One of the things you talk about at the beginning of the book that I thought was so poignant was you talk about one of the main issues being that we don't talk about grief in the right way, in the sense that we see it as a detour to our normal happy life. Like that's the default, you know?
Yeah.
And I couldn't help but think of the fact that like this feels like a very Western mentality. Even when I remember first time I got to travel internationally, and I was talking, and I'm always interested to see how people perceive us from other parts of the world. And I remember one of the things that stuck with me, and this conversation probably happened 20 years ago. This guy I talked to said, you know, we always view people from the United States as being somewhat fake. I said, what do you mean? He said, well, anytime you walk up to somebody, they're like, how are you doing? I'm good. I'm great. Whatever.
Great, good.
Not everybody's
yeah,
good or great. Like, you know, your life, somebody's life is falling apart, but yet we just kind of sugarcoat everything. And and plus on the receiving end, we don't really want to know that your life is falling apart because that makes us uncomfortable, you know? So like, you better say you're good or you're great. Like that's the only acceptable response. So I couldn't help but think like, this feels like a very Western mentality that our default should be joy and happiness and life is great.
Yeah. Yes, and I think that Western culture has perfected falsity. Falsity, I don't even know if that's a word, but we're going to claim it.
It is now.
I think that Western culture has perfected it. I think it's tricky territory when we start romanticizing other cultures and saying that they know how to do this. I think that there is a spectrum of emotional intelligence and death literacy and grief literacy. There are absolutely cultures in the world that are more emotionally honest. Absolutely. There are absolutely cultures in this wide, small planet. There are definitely cultures that are more blunt about the fact that death and suffering happen, for sure. That doesn't mean that they are skilled at dealing with it or responding to it. And I'm really, really wary of romanticizing and saying Western culture has it wrong and Eastern culture has it correct, because it's all a spectrum and there are issues with all of it, right? So a couple of examples here, prefacing this by saying I'm not an expert in any of these cultures. That is a thing. In Japan, there is the Jizo, right? Who is in Western culture, the language we would use is like the patron saint of babies and children. So you'll see Jizo sculptures and Jizo gardens where, it's for miscarriage and stillbirth and children and babies that die young, right? So there's a whole ceremony and there's a whole ritual around it, and it's amazing. And we could really use some ritual and ceremony and acknowledgement around those specific losses in Western culture, absolutely, because those are still secret. That is further along the spectrum of awesome than we might be in Western culture, but it still doesn't mean that in Japanese culture it's okay to be sad. It still doesn't mean that if your baby died 4 years ago and you have photos of them up, or you celebrate their birthday, or whatever, that like there isn't necessarily a cultural response that says that that's normal and healthy. There are a lot of Asian cultures, and I don't know this from personal experience. I know this from listening to some of my writers and students who come from those cultures talking to me about it and saying, like, we can do the ceremony, we can do the ritual, and that is understood and accepted, but it is not understood or accepted to talk about the impact moving forward. I say all of this so cautiously, so cautiously, but I just want us to be very mindful of not grass is greener, not romanticizing, and honestly, not co-opting other cultures' beliefs and practices and discarding the rest, right? Which is what we do with so many things that we decide they do it better. So let's take this. I think there is a lesson in there about the wide spectrum of different cultures, different generations' responses to the reality of human life and human existence, and what things might we learn from that, and where do we have room to improve, and always broadening that lens out, always widening the view you're taking in, because it is tempting. It is easy to say, oh, this culture does this better, right? Like Mexican culture does death better. The Japanese do miscarriage better. The Italians do like whatever death, like, okay, well, widen your lens out and look at what's beyond the ceremony. What is the actual lived reality like for grieving people in that culture? And it's not to fault find. It's not for that. I just don't like the either or thing, and we do it wrong and everybody else does it right, because honestly, cranky as it sounds, we all do it wrong. We all do it wrong because it is hard to watch people we care about be in pain. It's hard. And every culture has its way of erasing that pain. Right? Every culture needs a different, it's what we were talking about a minute ago with, like, it's the foundation that needs to change.
Yeah.
Right.
You made me think of a section in your book where I think it was one of the folks that participated in your the grief in writing mentions her experience with a Buddhist priest, and how she went to the Buddhist priest for comfort, and it was this very avoidant kind of advice, avoid the pain versus push into the pain. And so it just kind of, it made me think about the fact that, like, yeah, of course, like, it's, the way in which we poorly kind of respond to grief is not exclusive to the US or even Christianity. We're all kind of at fault for doing it wrong, no matter where you live or what, spirituality or non-spirituality that you practice.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I didn't put it into the book, but I had an experience very soon after my partner died. A friend of mine was very involved in the African Heritage Museum in our city, and she said, I really want you to meet with this person. He, he's an African chief, whatever. I can't remember, the rest of the ways that she described him. But, this was probably 10 days after Matt drowned, and I was like, I will take anything. And I went in and I met with him, and he told me, didn't ask me, he told me that I was damaging Matt's spirit by being sad, and that right in that very moment, I needed to bring him to the site where Matt drowned, and I needed to shave my head, and I needed to throw my hair in the river, and I needed to let him go. And I was damaging not only Matt in his spirit form, but also all of Matt's relations by not doing this. And I was like, thank you very much. And I left, and he followed me down the street and yelled, "Stand up to your full height. Do not walk like a sad person. Walk like the powerful being you are." I was like, what the hell?
Unreal. Oh my gosh.
Right? So again, I'm not saying that this person was representative of even his own culture's culture, because who knows? I don't know what was going on there. But it is really tempting to romanticize other cultures, other times, other peoples, anything, right? And say they have it down. And I just be really careful with that stuff, because it is a very human thing to be distressed by the suffering of others. And there are very, very few cultures, people, practices who know that our job is not to remove suffering, but to bring support alongside suffering. And I actually get really irritated with the commodification of Eastern traditions. I think I complain about this in the book too, about Buddhism and mindfulness and those spiritual practices. It's like those spiritual practices, from what I have learned and from what I have studied, like historical Buddha said, nature of life is suffering, the nature of life is pain, human life is full of pain. He didn't then go on to say, so like, don't think about it. Just like,
Right.
Don't let it bug you. The whole creation of what became Buddhist thought was, wow, there is so much pain in this world. And my temptation is to pretend it doesn't hurt. And I don't want to do that. I want to stay here and keep my eyes open and my heart open to the pain and the joy that is part of this world. How will I do that when everything in me wants to believe that this pain is not real? And so when you get watered down mindfulness practices, air quotes on mindfulness here, when you get watered down mindfulness practices or watered down co-opted spiritual beliefs that say that the most enlightened thing you can do is to rise above your pain, I am mad, because not only are you robbing yourself of the real magic and the real gift of a lot of those teachings, but what a diss to those teachings themselves. Like, we have incredibly powerful tools that have been handed down generation after generation after generation from various parts of the world about how to keep your eyes open to pain and suffering and how to listen without erasing. And what do? We use those tools to gaslight and erase and rise above and basically castrate any attempt at connection.
Deconstructed these walls and I found a business where the company line was the only way to get paid. We built a church uncertainty that fears everything against it, where the refugee suffers and the white man has it made. I won't do it anymore. It's taken me too long to recover. I'll go feed the sick and poor and try to help the world to recover. I sat myself in your pews every single week, and I gave you my money so that you would tell me what to think. And I learned from a book that you had taken the heart out of. And that's how I learned to make exclusion look like love. So come as you are. Take up your cross, use it to build a wall, and reach across the aisle and fire your guns so you can keep them. And love how you want. If we approve, and you'll be undefiled. So come, accept our gift, salvation from sinners. I won't do it anymore. It's taken me too long to recover. I'll go feed the sick and poor and try to help the world to recover. I won't do it anymore. It's taken me too long to recover. I'll go feed the sick and poor and try to help the world to recover. Gonna take a while to wade through the fear and the hurt. But I think there's a way for us to love and